was 22. It was fall of 2016, just after 7 in the evening, and I was still living in my parents' house, sleeping in the same room I'd had since high school. I had a degree I wasn't using, a part-time job that barely covered gas, and a constant pressure in my chest that told me I was falling behind everyone else my age. That was why I didn't question the email as much as I should have. The job offer was short and strangely casual. They needed someone to enter a building alone and describe what they saw in real time. No physical work, no hazards listed. One night only. Cash payment, handed over immediately. The amount was specific, not round, and it was exactly enough to cover a security deposit and first month's rent on a small apartment I'd been looking at online. I reread the message several times, waiting for the catch to reveal itself. There was no pressure, no emotional hook, no dramatic language, just a location, a time, and instructions to be clear and honest. I told myself it was probably an inspection job, maybe a research survey or a private insurance thing. People paid for odd tasks all the time. This one just happened to sound stranger than most. When I mentioned it to my parents, I minimized it, said it was a walkthrough, said I'd be late. They didn't push back. By then, they were used to letting me make my own mistakes. Nothing about it felt dangerous. It felt practical. At the time, it felt completely normal. When I arrived, the street was already blocked off. That should have been the first thing I questioned, but it wasn't. I remember parking where they told me to, a few houses down and walking the rest of the way with my hands in my jacket pockets, rehearsing what I'd say if someone asked who I was. No one did. The house sat at the end of the block, dark except for the harsh white lights pointed directly at it. Portable floodlights, the kind used at construction sites or accident scenes. They washed the siding flat and colorless like the place had been drained of anything familiar. What didn't make sense was how many people were there. I counted at least 2 uniformed security guards near the front, another by the side yard, and more shapes moving in the glare that I couldn't clearly make out. There was an ambulance parked with its engine running, lights off but ready. A few people stood near it wearing reflective vests, talking quietly. For an abandoned house. That thought surfaced clearly, then sank just as fast. I told myself it was a liability thing. Old structures meant risk. Maybe the owners were being cautious. Maybe this was part of some insurance documentation process that required emergency staff on standby. It wasn't my world. I didn't know how these things worked. One of the guards checked my name against a clipboard without looking at me for more than a second. He handed me a small headset and told me to put it on once I was inside. No explanation beyond that. His tone was calm, professional, bored even. Just describe what you see, he said, room by room. I asked who I'd be talking to. Someone listening, he replied, already turning away. I noticed then that no one else was entering the house, not the guards, not the paramedics, not the people with the vests. They stayed outside, maintaining distance, like there was an invisible line they weren't allowed to cross. That gave me a brief, tight feeling in my stomach. I dismissed it. I'd already accepted the job. I was already there. Turning around over a vague sense of unease felt childish. I didn't want to look unreliable or difficult. I needed this to go smoothly. As I stepped closer, I saw the front door was already open. No caution tape, no boards, just open, waiting. The house didn't look abandoned in the way I expected. No graffiti, no broken windows. The yard was overgrown, but not wildly. It looked more like something forgotten than something damaged. I took one last look back at the people outside. None of them were watching me directly. They were watching the house. I noticed that, and I chose not to think about it. The air inside was colder than I expected. Not the natural cool of an empty place in October, but a steady indoor chill that felt maintained, like the house had been sealed up, and the temperature had never been allowed to rise. The smell hit me a second later, dust, old wood, and something faintly chemical, like cleaning product that had dried on hard surfaces weeks ago. I stepped over the threshold and the sound changed immediately. Outside there had been murmuring voices, radio chatter, the low idle of vehicles. Inside it was quiet in a way that felt engineered. My footsteps didn't echo like they should have. The carpet in the entryway swallowed them. I remembered the headset and slid it on. The plastic was new and stiff. When I pressed the button on the side, a soft tone sounded in my ear and then a voice came through. Male, calm, slightly distorted. A couch with the cushions sagging inward, like someone had sat there for years and then just stood up one day and never came back. A television stand with nothing on it. Curtains drawn shut, but light seeped through the edges in thin lines, slicing the room into pale strips. Living room, I said into the headset. Old furniture, no electronics, curtains closed. Walls are off-white, some scuff marks near the baseboards. I expected my nerves to spike, but they didn't. It was boring. It looked like every neglected rental listing I'd ever clicked through at 2 in the morning. The more I talked, the more my voice settled. The place stopped feeling like a threat and started feeling like a task. I kept going, room by room, describing what was there and what wasn't. A dining room with a table and 3 mismatched chairs. A sideboard with the drawers half open, empty except for dust and a couple of dead insects curled in the corners. A kitchen with old appliances that didn't match, white fridge, black stove, a microwave that looked like it belonged in a college dorm. Kitchen, I said. Counters are clear, sink is dry, cabinets are mostly empty. I see one cracked plate in the upper cabinet. Still no response from the voice, just the faint hiss of the line, like someone holding their breath on the other end. I told myself they were recording. That was the point. I didn't need feedback. The longer I stayed inside, the more normal it felt. My shoulders loosened. My hands stopped sweating. The weirdness of the floodlights and the ambulance outside began to fade into the background of my mind, filed away as overkill. I even felt slightly embarrassed. All that tension in the car ride over, the little stabs of doubt on the sidewalk, the moment I noticed nobody else was coming in with me, it started to seem dramatic in hindsight. It was an empty house. I was just talking about dusty furniture into a headset. People did stranger jobs online for less money. I moved down a hallway toward the back. The floorboards creaked under the thin carpet runner. The sound small and regular, like the house shifting its weight. There were framed photos on the wall, but all the pictures had been removed, leaving only pale rectangles where the frames had protected the paint from sun and time. Hallway, I said. Photos gone. You can see outlines on the wall where frames used to hang. I passed a closed door and paused. My brain supplied an image of something waiting behind it, and I almost laughed at myself for it. I was working myself up again. That was all. I opened the door. A small bedroom, twin bed frame without a mattress, a dresser with the mirror missing, a closet door slightly ajar, empty hangers still on the rod. The room felt harmless, almost sad. Bedroom, I said. No mattress. Closet has hangers. Dresser is empty. I backed out and shut the door. My breathing was steady. My heart rate felt normal. For the first time since I'd arrived, I believed the simplest explanation. This was exactly what they said it was. A walkthrough. Documentation. Some kind of evaluation that required a neutral person inside describing the environment. I moved to the next door, then the next, sticking to the pattern. Speak, observe, move on. The routine became calming, like folding laundry, like making a list. And because it felt so routine, I stopped scanning for danger. I stopped listening for the things that didn't fit. I didn't notice how after a while the outside noise stopped bleeding through the walls. I didn't notice how the headset line got quieter, as if the hiss had been turned down. I just kept describing what was there, convinced I'd been silly to feel uneasy at all. That was the last normal thought I had in that house. The bathroom was at the end of the hall, the smallest door, the kind that stuck slightly when you pulled it open. The knob was cold. When it gave, the hinges complained in a dry, tired squeal that sounded too loud in the quiet house. Inside, the room smelled different from everything else. Not cleaner, not fresher, just wet somehow, like the air had been trapped there and never fully dried. The tile floor was pale blue, scuffed in the center where a bath mat must have sat for years. The tub had a yellowed ring near the drain. A plastic soap dish was still mounted on the wall, empty. Bathroom, I said into the headset. My voice came out steadier than I felt. Blue tile. Bathtub left side. Sink and mirror straight ahead. No personal items. The mirror was old, framed in metal that had lost its shine. It was spotted with tiny black freckles along the edges, like mold trapped under glass. I leaned closer, more out of habit than curiosity, and saw my own face looking back, pale in the floodlight leak, eyes a little too wide. For a second, the normality of seeing myself in there made me relax again. I was just me in a dusty house doing a weird job for money. I could almost hear the voice on the other end taking notes, indifferent. Then, behind my reflection, there was color. I didn't register it at first. My brain treated it like a trick of light, like a shadow from the doorway shifting. But it didn't move. It stayed fixed behind my right shoulder, a rectangle of dark reds and browns that didn't match the washed-out bathroom. I stared at my own reflection, trying to process what I was seeing without turning around. It was a painting. Not a framed photo outline on a wall, not a stain, not a patch of darker paint. An actual painting, upright, leaning slightly as if it had been placed there casually. It was in the doorway behind me, visible in the mirror as a solid object. My throat tightened. I felt that familiar embarrassment rise me, overreacting again. I told myself I must have missed it when I walked in. Maybe it had been sitting just outside the bathroom and I hadn't looked back. Maybe it was in the hall the entire time, and my angle was only catching it now. But I knew the hall. I'd described it. I'd even mentioned the pale rectangles on the wall where frames had been. I'd walked that strip of carpet 3 times already, opening doors, narrating details, building a mental map of where everything was. There hadn't been a painting there. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I just stared into the mirror until my eyes watered slightly, like if I stared long enough it would resolve into something else. A coat. A curtain. Anything that made sense. The voice in my headset was still silent, which somehow made it worse. It meant they were hearing me breathe. Hearing my pulse. I'm still in the bathroom, I said. I'm looking at the mirror. No response. The painting in the mirror looked like a portrait, but the brushwork was rough and dark. The background was muddy, almost black. The figure in the center was pale enough to stand out, but the face was indistinct, like the artist had smeared it before it dried. The only clear part was the eyes, two darker spots that seemed too precisely placed for something that blurred everywhere else. My skin prickled along my arms. I finally forced myself to turn around. The doorway behind me was empty. Just the hall, dim and flat, the carpet runner leading away. No canvas, no frame, no rectangle of color, nothing leaning there, nothing hanging, nothing even that could be mistaken for it. I turned back to the mirror so fast my neck hurt. The painting was still there in the reflection, exactly where it had been. A cold, slow weight settled in my stomach, not like panic, more like realization. The kind you get when you double-check a lock and find it already open. The kind that makes you understand you've been assuming the wrong thing the whole time. My mouth went dry. I'm seeing something in the mirror, I said quietly, and hated how small my voice sounded. There's a painting behind me. This time the headset clicked, a faint shift, like someone adjusting their hand on a mic. Describe it, the voice said. That was the moment I understood I was wrong. Not about the painting, about the job. About the house being just a house. About the floodlights and the ambulance being overkill. They hadn't brought all that equipment because the building was dangerous. They'd brought it because what was inside didn't stay where it should. I asked if I could leave. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't panic. I just said it plainly, like a reasonable request after a misunderstanding. I think I've done enough, I said into the headset. I'm uncomfortable. I'd like to step outside. There was a pause that stretched too long to be technical. Then the voice came back, calm and precise. Negative. Remain inside and continue. I felt heat crawl up my neck. I'm not refusing the job, I said. I just need a break. I can finish later. Another pause. Shorter this time. You will remain where you are. I turned toward the hallway, already moving. My body had decided before my brain finished arguing. The bathroom suddenly felt too small, like the walls had shifted inward while I wasn't looking. I took 3 steps before I heard it. A sharp metallic click, followed by the low hum of something engaging. Not inside the house. Outside. I stopped and looked back at the front door, visible at the end of the hall through the living room. The open doorway I'd come through was now filled with a solid shape. A security gate, pulled down and locked in place, its metal grid catching the floodlights and throwing long shadows across the floor. My chest tightened. That wasn't there before, I said. The voice didn't answer. I tried the back door next. It was locked, solid, unmoving. The windows didn't open either. Painted shut, maybe. Or sealed intentionally. I couldn't tell. I didn't have my phone to use as a light or a camera or anything grounding. I'd been told to leave it in the car to avoid interference. Outside, I could still see people through the glass. Guards. Vests. The outline of the ambulance. None of them were looking at me. They were all facing away from the house now, like their job was to keep something in, not let someone out. I went back to the headset. You said this was a walkthrough, I said. You didn't say I couldn't leave. You agreed to remain until completion, the voice replied. You are safe. I didn't believe that word anymore. Safe. Who are you? I asked. Another pause. Then continue describing what you see. I realized then that arguing wasn't changing anything. Every answer was the same shape, just phrased differently. I was contained politely, professionally, and completely. Even if I forced my way to a window, even if I started screaming, I wasn't sure anyone would react. Or if they did, whether it would be for my benefit. I stood there, breathing shallow, trying to think. The painting was still visible in the mirror when I glanced back into the bathroom. Still watching, still impossible. Okay, I said finally, because compliance felt safer than resistance. I'll continue. My voice sounded thin, but it was steady. That scared me more than panic would have, because it meant some part of me had already accepted that I wasn't in control anymore. They told me to stay where I was. Not the bathroom specifically, just inside the house, and not to attempt to interact with anything that wasn't already there. The wording stuck with me. Already there. As if the house had rules about presence that I didn't understand. I moved back into the living room because it was the largest space. I told myself open areas were safer, even though I had no reason to believe that. The couch sat exactly where it had been before, its cushions still caved inward. Nothing looked disturbed. That almost made it worse. I stood in the center of the room and stopped walking. The headset stayed quiet unless I spoke. When I did, the voice acknowledged me with short confirmations. No encouragement, no concern, just enough to remind me I was being monitored. I didn't sit. Sitting felt like surrendering something I might need later. So I stood there, hands hanging uselessly at my sides, and tried to slow my breathing without closing my eyes. The house made sounds when I stopped moving. Not loud ones, small ones. The faint tick of cooling pipes, the soft shift of wood as temperature changed. A distant creak that could have been the roof settling or something heavier redistributing weight. I described all of it. Ambient noise, I said. Structure is responding. Normal house sounds. The words felt like lies, but they were the closest things to truth I could manage. Time stopped behaving normally. Without my phone, without windows I could trust, I had no reference point. Minutes stretched thin and wide. Seconds piled up until they lost meaning. I started measuring time by my own body instead. How often I swallowed, how my calves ached from standing still, how my mouth kept drying out no matter how often I breathed through my nose. I didn't move because moving felt like inviting attention. I didn't sit because sitting felt like giving permission. I stayed exactly where I was and waited, because waiting was the only thing that hadn't made things worse yet. At some point, I became aware of the floorboards beneath me in a new way. Not just a texture through my shoes, but the depth, the layered feeling of something hollow under something solid. I imagined the space between floors, the dark cavity where wires and pipes ran, and wondered if that space felt different when something passed through it. I held my breath, listening. Nothing approached. Nothing retreated. That was worse. I realized then that survival didn't always mean hiding or fighting or escaping. Sometimes it meant becoming background, becoming furniture, becoming just another object in the room that didn't warrant interaction. I didn't fight. I didn't run. I waited. And in that waiting, I felt smaller than I ever had before, reduced to breath and balance, and the hope that whatever rules governed this place still allowed me to remain where I was, untouched, for a little while longer. I didn't notice it arrive. There was no sound to mark the moment, no footstep or shift in the air. 1 second I was alone in the living room, cataloging the familiar creaks and ticks, and the next I had the unmistakable awareness of something close enough to matter. It wasn't behind me. That was the worst part. If it had been behind me, I would have felt watched. Anticipation, fear, adrenaline, all the normal reactions. Instead, it felt like pressure, like the space around my body had subtly changed density. The air near my left side felt wrong, heavier, as if my shoulder were brushing against a wall that hadn't been there before. I didn't turn my head. I didn't breathe. Every instinct screamed at me to look, to confirm, to understand what was occupying that space. But another part of me, quieter and more convincing, told me that seeing it would count as participation. That acknowledgement might be all it needed. My eyes stayed fixed on the far wall. I became acutely aware of my heartbeat. Each pulse felt loud, intrusive, like it might give me away. I tried to slow it, counting between beats, but my body wasn't listening anymore. It had gone into something older than fear, something close to submission. The headset crackled softly. "Continue," the voice said. I almost laughed. The absurdity of it pressed against hysteria, but the sound never made it out of my throat. My jaw was clenched too tight. "There is." I started, then stopped. Naming felt dangerous. Defining shape or location felt like drawing a line that could be crossed. "There is a change in proximity," I said instead. "Something is very close to me." The silence that followed was immediate and absolute. The pressure increased. Not a touch, not contact, just closeness, reduced to its purest form. I could sense height now, the way you sense someone standing next to you without looking. It felt taller than me, close enough that if it shifted its weight, it would brush against my arm. I held my breath until my vision started to darken at the edges. A thought surfaced, clear and horrifying in its simplicity. If it took one more step, if it closed that last inch of space, there would be no way to pretend it wasn't happening. I would have to react, and I didn't know what reaction was allowed. Seconds stretched thin. My lungs burned. My hands trembled at my sides, muscles screaming for movement. I felt like a child being tested, waiting to see if I'd flinch. Then, just as suddenly as it had arrived, the pressure stopped increasing. It stayed. Right there. Close enough that I knew, without any doubt, that I was no longer alone in that room, and that whatever shared the space with me was fully aware of my presence. I exhaled slowly, carefully, praying that breathing didn't count as an invitation, because I was certain of one thing. If I moved even slightly, this would stop being a near miss, and I was already a second away. Ended without warning. No build-up. No signal. No relief. The pressure beside me vanished so completely that for a fraction of a second I felt off balance, like I'd been leaning against something solid that suddenly wasn't there. My body reacted before my thoughts did. My knees buckled slightly, and I had to shift my weight to keep from falling. The headset screeched with feedback, not loud but sharp, like a microphone dragged across fabric. The sound made me flinch, and that flinch finally broke whatever stillness had been protecting me. "Step back," the voice said, no longer calm. Do not turn around. Step back slowly. I did exactly what I was told. One foot, then the other, moving away from where the pressure had been, even though I couldn't tell what direction that was anymore. The living room felt wrong now, stretched and unfamiliar, like the dimensions had changed while I wasn't looking. Something heavy slammed against the outside of the house, not an impact like a crash, more like a forceful seal being broken. The walls shuddered. Dust shook loose from somewhere above and drifted down in the floodlight glow bleeding through the curtains. Then everything went quiet. No house noises, no distant engines, no hiss in the headset. For one long second, there was nothing at all. Hands grabbed me from behind. Real hands. Human hands. Firm, urgent, wrapped around my arms and shoulders. I gasped and twisted instinctively, but they held fast and pulled me backward. "Don't fight," someone said close to my ear. "It's over." I was dragged through the living room, my feet catching on the carpet, my heart pounding hard enough to hurt. The front gate was gone. The door stood open again, night air rushing in like the house had been holding its breath. Floodlights blinded me as I was pulled outside. The cold hit next. Then voices. Too many to separate. Orders, confirmation, someone calling for medical. I stumbled as they released me, and a different set of hands caught me before I could hit the ground. I expected relief to come crashing in. Shaking. Crying. Something. It didn't. As I stood there wrapped in a blanket I didn't remember being given, I looked back at the house. The windows were dark, the doorway empty. It looked normal again, like it had never contained anything at all. That was the worst part, not knowing what had ended. Only that it had. They didn't let me go home right away. I was led to the ambulance and sat on the edge while someone pressed a paper cup of water into my hands. My fingers were shaking so badly I spilled most of it onto the blanket around my shoulders. Another person gave me 2 pills and told me they'd help with shock. I didn't ask what they were. I swallowed them dry. No one asked me what I saw. Not really. A man with a clipboard took my name and date of birth and told me I'd be contacted if anything else was needed. When I tried to explain about the painting, about the pressure in the room, he stopped writing and looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded once and wrote something different. I realized then that there was a version of events they wanted, and it wasn't mine. I was driven home by someone I didn't recognize. He didn't introduce himself. The car smelled like antiseptic and old coffee. We didn't talk. When we pulled up in front of my parents' house, he waited until I was inside before driving away. The next morning, the house from the job was gone. Not boarded up, not condemned. Gone. I checked local news sites, thinking maybe there had been a fire or a gas leak overnight. There was nothing. No articles. No photos. When I drove past the street later that week, there was an empty lot where the house had been. Fresh dirt. Temporary fencing. A sign announcing future development. Like it had never existed. I tried to tell people what happened. Carefully at first. Friends. Co-workers. My parents. I softened the edges, left out the parts that sounded impossible. Even then, the reactions were the same. Concern, followed by polite disbelief. Eventually, I stopped talking about it. A few weeks later, an envelope arrived with no return address. Inside was cash, counted exactly to the amount promised in the email. No note, no explanation. Just proof that the job had been completed. That was worse than if it hadn't come at all. Because it meant someone still knew where I lived. Someone still considered the matter closed. The authorities never followed up. No calls, no statements, no record I could access. It was as if I'd stepped briefly into a place that existed alongside the real world, then been pushed back out and told to forget it. But forgetting isn't something you choose. I still wake up sometimes with the sense that the air beside my bed is too close, that if I turn my head, I'll see something that doesn't belong there, waiting patiently for me to notice. The house was erased. I wasn't, and that feels intentional. I went back to my life. That's what everyone expected. And on the surface, that's what I did. I moved into a small apartment a few months later. I started a different job. I paid bills. I laughed at the right moments. From the outside, nothing about me looked broken. But something had shifted permanently. I notice things now. Not dramatic things. Small ones. Objects that feel newly present in places I'm certain I've already looked. A chair angled slightly wrong. A reflection that holds for half a second longer than it should. I'll pause in a doorway, convinced something has changed behind me, and then feel ridiculous for checking. I've learned not to comment on it, because the few times I did, people smiled the way you smile at someone who's still recovering. The way that quietly closes conversations. Mirrors bother me the most. I don't trust what appears in them right away. I look, then look again, searching for additions rather than absences. I can't explain why. I just know that what happened in that house taught me something fundamental and irreversible. That noticing matters. That attention is not neutral. Whatever was there didn't attack me. It didn't chase me. It didn't need to. It waited until I became aware of it, until I understood proximity, until I recognized the shared space between us.